For the last week, I've been experimenting with one of the most difficult photo shoots I think I've ever tried to tackle. Today, I'm gonna be dripping ink and paint into water to create kind of an abstract image that can be used both on its own or in composite work. Fair warning, this is gonna get very, very messy. Today's video is sponsored by AC/DC's Photo Studio Pro 2020. If you're tired of Adobe charging a monthly fee to use their software like Photoshop and Lightroom, Photo Studio Pro could be the perfect software for you. For most photographers out there, this software has all the tools that you need, and in some cases even has more advanced tools that you really can't find anywhere else. One of these cool features is their face detection and recognition tool, which allows you to categorize images based on your subject's face. Features like this make Photo Studio Pro act almost like Photoshop and Lightroom all in one. This software is extremely affordable, but if you go to the link in the description below, you can try it completely for free without having to spend a single dime. If you like it, you can either rent it for just $10 a month, or you can buy it flat out and use it for years to come. At the end of this video, I'm gonna be using Photo Studio Pro to do a couple quick edits on today's final images. Now, since I've had a lot of free time over the course of this coronavirus pandemic, I've had a lot of time to think about some photo shoots that I've wanted to revisit. And one of those photo shoots I've been meaning to do for years involves capturing ink and paint as it dissolves into water. Seems easy, right? Well, it's not as easy as you would think. Let me show you some of the things that you might want to use that will make your life a whole lot easier if you decide to do this at home. If you want any of this information, head to the link below. I have links to every single thing mentioned in this video. First, you need a clear tank to shoot through so you can capture the material you drip into the water. At first, I thought it would be a good idea to buy a 10-gallon aquarium, but that turned out to be a big hassle because every time you do this experiment, you have to dump the water, and 10 gallons can be pretty heavy. Later, I wound up buying a 4-gallon tank, but even this turned out to be a little bit bigger than what you probably need. Next, you're gonna need to prepare your setup in a place that's near a drain and running water because you're gonna have to dump and fill the tank up over and over and over and over. You get the idea. You're gonna do this experiment a lot of times because there's a lot of variability every time you drop the ink, and you're never gonna get the results that you think you're gonna get no matter how well you plan for it. I wound up shooting here in the studio because I like air conditioning, but if you were to do this outside in the shade, it would probably make your life a whole lot easier. Now for lenses, I wound up doing a test with my Tamron 24-70, my Tamron 70-200, and my Nikkor 60mm macro, and I found that I got the sharpest results with the greatest amount of depth of field with my 24-70. So this is the lens that I wound up using, and I shot this at 70mm. Now make sure you're using a tripod with your camera because without an assistant, this is nearly impossible to do without stabilizing the lens. You're gonna wanna get everything dialed in perfectly, and then you're gonna wanna just simply hit the camera with one hand while you're pouring dye with the other. Now to guarantee the max amount of sharpness while shooting through glass and water, I wound up putting a big metal ruler and manually setting the focus to about the first 1/3 of the tank. This wound up being about the 2 or 3 inch mark on this ruler. You can see this here. Everything is nice and sharp, and it gives me a lot of space to work with. Keep in mind, you are gonna wanna do this every time you lift and dump your tank, so keep that ruler handy. So let's talk about camera settings. I wound up setting my shutter speed to 1/200th of a second so that I could eliminate all the ambient light. I stopped my lens down to about f16 to give me a few inches of depth of field. And then I set the ISO to about 400 to 800 so that I could get the most amount of light while shooting with a really small aperture. So now that we have an entirely black frame, we're going to need to illuminate our ink with a strobe, and for that, I'm using the ProPhoto B10. Now you could use any light modifier that you want. You could use a big softbox to give you really nice, soft, even light, but in this case, I went with a spot grid so that I could make a much more dramatic image by only illuminating the middle part of my frame and allowing a lot of the colors of the ink to go into complete darkness. I also love this little tabletop light stand. This is one of my favorite things. Usually use this for background lights, but in this case, I'm gonna be putting it on the table, and it raises up pretty easily. Awesome light stand. Now, using a strobe is going to guarantee that you get the sharpest image possible, but you could also use hot lights. So if you have a couple of these LED lights, you could illuminate your scene. You may not get the fastest shutter, and you may not freeze motion quite as well as you will with a strobe. You will also run into the potential of ambient light in your room affecting your overall exposure. So if you want the best quality out of your image, I recommend getting rid of the LED lights and using strobes in this instance. Next, you're gonna have to decide if you wanna shoot against white or black background. And for white, you're gonna wanna put a piece of white foam core up behind and fire a strobe into this. Also, you want to put this as far away from your background so that you don't get any flare. If you want that background to go completely black, you can put a piece of black foam core right behind your tank, or If you want, just turn off your backlight, make sure your whole set is far enough from the wall, and shooting at these settings, you're probably gonna get a pretty dark background anyway. As you're setting up your lights and getting everything in position and taking some test shots, you're probably gonna start to notice little air bubbles clinging to the side of the tank. Go ahead and take some time to remove these bubbles because you're gonna save yourself a lot of time by not having to edit these out later in post-production. Now, the final thing that you need to consider is the type of medium that you're actually going to be dropping into your water. I've seen some amazing videos on YouTube where people are using acrylic ink, which is gonna give you shapes that are super clean, bold, and fluid looking when they hit the water. You can also use something like this, just general food coloring. This is gonna be a little more translucent and not quite as dense as the acrylic inks. Other paints that you can use are acrylic paints like these. I've literally done all kinds of things. These are typically gonna be a little bit more stringy when you drop them in. You may wanna mix them in water. For that, I have these little bottles that I bought. You can mix your colors in here and then you can either drip them in or place them into the water and squirt them out. This is really handy. And if you want a completely different look, you can get some basic ink dye that you might use for clothing. When I dripped this into the water, I found that this had a cloudy effect, which was kind of cool. It looked a little bit more like dry powder exploding, which was interesting, but with using black dye like this, you're gonna cloud up your water really, really quickly, so I wound up only using this a few times. One thing that saved me a lot of time is no matter what type of material you wind up using, also get a small container of water that you can do little test runs with so that you can guarantee you have the perfect consistency before you start dripping things into your big tank. Now for the frustrating part. No matter what medium you decide to pour in your tank, be prepared to do this over and over and over again because you're only gonna get one chance to get a really clean shot of the pluming material coming into the water, and then after that, everything is gonna get very murky and cloudy. For me, I found that the messy, more abstract photos actually looked more interesting because I liked how all the different layers and densities mixed together to produce a complex looking scene. But if you're going for that super clean look, you're only gonna get a few images before you're gonna have to dump that tank out and start all over again. One final tip, you're also going to want to experiment with how the ink enters the water and at which velocity it hits the water. If you drip the ink in from above the water line, you're gonna find that it hits the water, it breaks apart, and then it starts to fall down and it gets really messy. With paint, it can be really stringy. If you can come up with a way to drip the ink inside the water a few inches below the water line, you'll find that once it hits the actual water, it plumes up and it dissolves a lot slower. It's also gonna be more in the middle of your frame. And overall, I found this to be the best effect, but definitely experiment because every one of these techniques is gonna produce wildly different results. So now that we've taken a bunch of images with the key light in different positions, we've used different inks and dyes, and we've played around with the backdrop being white and being black, let's take these final images into post-production and clean them up for a final result. All right, so here we are in the post-production studio, and I am currently in AC/DC's Photo Studio Professional 2020. Let's go over here and look at our files. If I come down here to Best Raws, these are the images that I'm gonna be looking at. And if I come up here to View, it's gonna allow me to view these full screen. And let me just run through some of these images quickly so you can kind of see what they look like. These images were shot on black, and I can tell I'm probably going to need to brighten these up a little bit. And then I reset everything and I did some more with the dye. I love this billowing effect down here where the ink and the paint is hitting the bottom and kind of flowing back up. And then at this point, they started to mix a little bit more with the water and it became a little bit more abstract. Now in this image, this is where I used some of the acrylic dye and I was able to get more of the cloudy look. Now remember, you're only gonna be able to shoot this for a few seconds before the water gets too contaminated. Here is a different image, and if I zoom in here, you can see we have that real whimsical look that's really nice. This image is really neat. I love the look of this too, just this layered texture. Here's another example where I was using the thicker paint, and you can see it gives that real thick, droopy look. I'm not sure that I like that quite as much, but there's some interesting stuff going on down here. This is really pretty too. And then some of my favorite images are actually these last images. I love this area right here. I have this idea that I might do in the future where I photograph a swimmer kind of swimming through all of this, and I love this area because it almost looks like a little swim through, like you could have a leg or an arm or something going through there, and I think that would look pretty interesting. And then these are really cool too. I have them backlit from above instead of from the side, and I just think it has a lot of atmosphere. It just looks really interesting to me. So let's go ahead and clean a few of these images up. Let's start with one of these back here. This image is really nice, so I'm gonna come up here and go to Develop. And the first thing I want to do is brighten this up a little bit. So I'm going to come over here to General, and I'm going to be able to pull the exposure up just a touch. And let's play around with the saturation a little bit. If I bring this all the way down, I get a really moody black and white image. This almost looks like smoke, so if you needed some kind of smoke texture, this would work well too. If I go too far up, it starts to get a little too saturated, so maybe something right around there. You can also play with the dehaze, and that's going to bring out some of the texture a little bit better. And then the clarity, if I pull it down too much, it's going to make it a little soft. If I go up too high, it's going to be a little too sharp. So maybe somewhere right around here looks pretty good. Now we can go down to white balance. You're probably familiar with all of these settings if you've used other photo editing software. And here we can play with the white balance to really create some separation. If I go too blue, you can see everything falls in that really blue category, which if you wanted this to look completely underwater, maybe this would be the route that you go. But if you want to pull out some of the colors in your paint and your inks, I think maybe I actually want it to be a little warmer. Let's do 7700, and then the tint is the same way. We could push this more with some greens, or we could put a little bit more magenta in there. I like it actually somewhere right around -6. If we want to adjust the tones even further, we can come down here to Light EQ, and this is going to give us control over our shadows, midtones, and highlights. Now, if I bring my shadows up too much, you can see it's revealing way too much detail, and it's also showing a lot of the grain in this image. So I'm going to keep my shadows, I'm actually going to push them down a little bit. Let's take our midtones and we can pull them up just a touch. And then our highlights, we can play with those as well. I think I like the highlights actually pulled down. At any moment, I can come over here to this little deactivate group, and I can turn this on and off, and you can see what each one of these settings is doing. So this light EQ just gives me a little more contrast, and then we went from almost an underexposed image to something that's exposed a little bit better, like that. So this looks pretty good. One thing I know I need to do is I need to clean up some of the debris and highlights that are in this image. So I'm going to come up here to Repair, and for this I'm going to choose the healing brush. And in Photo Studio Professional, you basically just right-click near the object to set your repair point, and then you left-click to fix the point. So if I want to remove some of this here, and if I just right-click and then paint this seam that I can see in the background, that looks pretty good. If I want to get rid of this seam here, I can do all of this with just the mouse. I don't have to hit anything on the keyboard, which is really nice. I'm getting a little issue here on the far left, so I can go down to Clone, right-click, and this will actually clone the exact pixels to the right. So that cleans that up just a little bit easier. And it would take a while to get rid of all of these little dust specks here, but you can see I can just come in here, right-click, and then left-click. I can clean these up pretty quickly. So this is where it really pays off to clean your tank and get rid of all of these bubbles well in advance. And then finally, let's do a little crop here. Let's go back up to, let's go to Geometry and come down here to the crop tool. And I just want to crop right past this edge of the acrylic on the right. So I do that and hit Enter. It's going to apply the changes. And that's basically my final image there. Let's look at another photograph. Here we have an image of our red dye. Let's go to Develop. And the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a crop. And let's play with the perspective a little bit. I want to get my lines perfectly straight. So by turning this vertical slider, I can take an image that just has a little bit of keystoning. And if I pull this down, just like that, I can get my verticals really straight there. And then if I go to the horizon, something like that's pretty straight on the bottom. I'm just going to pick my crop tool, and for this image, maybe I place it right about here. And now let's play around with this. What I really want to do is I want to make my whites extremely white, but I don't want to lose too much detail in the ink itself. So let's come up here to General. And you can notice with exposure, if I start bumping it up too much, it's changing the color of my ink. So I think by using the light EQ and the color EQ, I can make my background go pure white while also bringing some more definition to my ink as well. So let's start with the light EQ. And what I want to do here is I want to go pull my highlights all the way up, and that's going to help blow out the white back here. I want to start playing with my midtones, and I want to bring them down just a bit so that I can bring some of that detail out and make it a little less hazy. And then with the shadows, you really can pull the shadows almost all the way down and you're going to get a lot of detail there. Now I've completely changed the color of my ink. If I turn this on and off, you can see I've gone from kind of a pink red color to now almost a orange color. So let me leave that on. Now let's go down to color EQ. And here we have all of the color profiles that we can change. We can change their saturation, their brightness, their hue, and their contrast. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to play around with the brightness of my orange and my red. You can see if I pull this down a little bit, I'm going to get a little bit more detail in those colors. And then the red gives a little bit more detail right there on the outermost parts of this plume. There's a little bit of yellow here. If I pull the yellow up, I can get a little bit more detail out right there. And then I think everything else, I don't think it's really going to do anything because we don't have a lot of those colors there. I can also go to saturation. And I can bump up the saturation of the red just a little bit. If I bump up the orange, you can see I'm going to start blowing out some of those channels. So I actually might pull the orange down just a little bit. Something like that's pretty cool. And then I can come down to hue. And with the orange slider, I can start to pull back the colors and get it to look a little bit more like the original. And if I really want to fine tune this even more, I can come down to tone curves. And here I can pull back a little bit of my shadows. Maybe even a little bit of my highlights here. If I could just do a classic kind of S curve. And then right here in the mid-tone is where I'm going to be able to really fine-tune how much detail I have. Something like that looks pretty good. If I want to control this even more, I think I can come down to the blue channel, and if I start tweaking this, I'm going to adjust the overall color of everything. And I just came back up here for a second to the general, and I just bumped the clarity and the dehaze a little bit. You can see what the dehaze does. If I pull it all the way to the right, it starts to make it look a little bit more like the original. If I bring the dehaze to the left, it brings out just a little bit more detail. I think you can go a little crazy with the dehaze. The same thing with the clarity. If I bring it too far to the right, it just makes it a little too sharp. So maybe something like 16 looks pretty good. Now, one final thing I want to show you that you can do with this is you can come down here to Effects. They have this gradient map. If we click this, we can essentially turn our background into any color that we want and change the color of our ink to anything that we want. So this is really useful if you're trying to go for a two-tone kind of look. If we want the highlights to be pure white, we can do that there. Let me also quickly come up to Repair and just clone out this corner. I'm just going to select right here and then just paint all of this out. It's just going to guarantee that my whole image is nice and white on the edges there. Let's go back to Tune. And then with the shadows, we can now control exactly what color we want our ink to be. This is really great because if you find that the best image that you took is in a color that you weren't super excited about, you can use this gradient map and completely change the color to really anything you want. And one other useful application of this gradient map is right now we have the highlights set to white and the shadows set to blue. But if I come here to highlights and I set this to black, check this out. It now makes my entire image the opposite. It's almost as if I shot this against a black background. So this is really useful if you find that, oh, I shot something on black or on white, and later when you're masking things, you need it to be the opposite. Just come down here to Gradient Map, set your highlights or your shadows to the opposite color, and you'll be able to quickly have inverse background from what you shot it on. Let's look at one final image. So this is probably my favorite photo. I love all the swirls that you can see on the top, and that was created just because the camera is tilted just a little bit so that I can see the top of the water line. However, having my camera tilted up a little bit, you can see I'm losing some of the tank here on the top left because I have that keystoning. So again, let's go back to geometry and let's play with the perspective here. And what I'm looking to do is either pull the top out or push the bottom in. And I can do that here just by pulling the vertical to the right just a little bit. I can also straighten up the bottom line. Something like that looks pretty good. And now let's come up here to the crop. And at the moment, it's constrained to the original aspect ratio. If I unclick this constrain proportion dialog box, I can now make the crop tool any size that I want. So something like this square shape might work well. Let's raise this up a little bit. Now, one thing that's interesting about shooting in a tight acrylic box is that I do have some of the highlights and shadows caused by my lighting, which makes this feel like we are in maybe a deep tank and you can see the walls. I think that's really cool, especially if you ever wanted to composite somebody in who is swimming and they want to be in a room. If you wanted to, you could come up here to repair and you could start cloning all of this out with, say, the heel brush. Something like this. So that looks pretty good. I might come back up here to geometry and crop this just a little bit tighter. Maybe I'll make this more like a 4x5 frame. So something like this might look a little bit more natural. It'll also get rid of the black on the right. And for this image, I'm not going to go through the general editing and white balance editing. Let's come down here to color. And if we set this to hue, and let's play around with the magentas. You can see we can really bring back some detail and make it go a little more blue, which looks pretty cool. I like the magenta color myself. You can also do some minor contrast adjustments. Instead of brightening the whole image or trying to edit by shadows, midtones, and highlights, you could come down here to the magenta, select the brightness, and then you could kind of tone it just by selectively adjusting the contrast on each one of these colors. So you can see my red slider controls kind of the highlights up here on the top. If I want to accentuate those, I could pull those out a little bit. And then once again, let's come down to effects and let's go back to our gradient map. And if we choose black for the shadows, we now can make an image that's a little bit more monotone. And let's go into a normal underwater color, kind of a cyan color. Something like that looks almost natural. You might actually believe that this could be shot deep underwater. It just has that vibe to it. And then if we feel like that's a little much, you can play with the opacity and just do a little subtle blend in there somewhere. So a lot of flexibility that you can do in this software. And when you're doing this kind of stuff, what's really cool is it's just art. This doesn't have to have correct skin tones. This doesn't have to have light that looks natural in the shadows and the highlights. Like, this is so abstract and we don't always know what we're looking at that you can really go crazy here and create some really interesting effects. And in a future video, I might take one of these images and try to mix it in as a layer on top of some other imagery that I've shot. So definitely subscribe to our channel if you want to check that out. I'm going to do a couple more videos based on water in the near future. So if you want to get your own copy of AC/DC Photo Studio Professional 2020, make sure you go to the description below. You can download this software and try it out for free, see if it's something that works for your workflow. If you enjoy this kind of content, make sure you head over to fstoppers.com. We have free daily content there every single day. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel below for photography and Photoshop tutorials. If you want to check out our sister channel, Fstoppers Live, we do tons of streaming content there, including our Critique the Community. Also, if you want to learn from some of the best photographers in the world, head over to fstoppers.com/store where you can check out our full-length tutorials. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'd love to see the creations that you guys create. Upload some of them to the Fstoppers community. I'd love to see what you guys are doing while you're stuck inside. See you guys soon.